What if the biggest battle you are facing right now isn't out there, in the headlines, or even in your immediate circumstances, but right here, Faye? What if the heaviest weight on your shoulders isn't a debt, or a difficult relationship, or a demanding job, but something far more insidious, far more silent? This isn't just about ancient Israel. This is about Faye. For 20 agonizing years, the nation of Israel lived under the suffocating thumb of King Jabin of Canaan and his brutal general, Sisera. 20 years of terror, 20 years of fear, his army, 900 iron chariots. Let that sink in. 900 unstoppable war machines. In an age of foot soldiers, these were the equivalent of modern-day tanks, fast, merciless, unyielding. Can you imagine the sheer, soul-crushing dread of hearing the thunderous rumble of those iron wheels approaching? Can you feel the dust on your tongue, the tremor in the ground, the desperate certainty that resistance was futile? Every attempt to rise up was met with overwhelming force, with metal, with fire, with the screams of your people. Their strength withered, their identity as God's chosen people faded into a distant, painful whisper. But here's the unsettling truth, the one we often miss. Their suffering wasn't just the result of an overpowering enemy. It was the painful, bitter fruit of a spiritual rebellion. Israel had once walked intimately with the living God, bound by a sacred covenant. They were set apart. They were His. But slowly, subtly, their hearts drifted. They chose comfort over covenant. They bowed before false idols. They sought guidance from foreign gods. They disregarded the very commandments that had once shaped their destiny. The Lord had warned them time and again, yet they chose rebellion over righteousness. And as prophesied, their disobedience paved the way for their downfall. Isn't it haunting how easily divine favor can slip away? How quickly the heart can turn cold, trading freedom for fleeting pleasure, divine presence for passing distraction. They lost their way. They forgot their God. And their chains, though forged by an enemy, were allowed by their own choices. This isn't just a history lesson. It is a mirror. Look closely. What comfort are you clinging to? What hidden compromises are you making in your own life right now? What spiritual drift has gone unaddressed? What burdens are you carrying that are silently crushing your spirit and dimming your light? Are you perhaps living under an oppression you unknowingly invited? The unconventional general, when God redefines leadership, if you think you know what a leader looks like, what a deliverer should be, then prepare for God to shatter every single one of your expectations. Picture this: a nation gripped by fear, paralyzed, leaderless. For 2 decades, the men of Israel trembled. No man dared to step forward. No sword was lifted. No rallying cry was heard. A deafening silence where courage should have been. The roar of Sisera's chariots was almost drowned out by the echoing vacuum of leadership. The people cried out in desperation, a plea rising from the ruins of their rebellion, mingled with anguish and the distant memory of a God who once parted seas and toppled walls. And heaven, though seemingly silent for a time, was not indifferent. From within their darkest hour, God began to prepare a deliverer, a light in the shadows. And no one, absolutely no one, could have expected Faye. She didn't arrive on a war horse. She wasn't clad in gleaming armor. She didn't shout like a warrior or storm enemy gates. She came with wisdom, with clarity, with a divine authority that could not be silenced. Her name was Deborah, a prophetess, a judge, a woman, unlike any other in Israel's history. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to be chosen to lead in a world that tells you leadership isn't yours? Her court was no palace. She judged Israel from beneath the shade of a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel, a simple, sacred gathering point for those seeking truth and justice. They came with disputes and despair. They left with vision and peace. She didn't raise her voice. She raised her spirit. Her discernment cut through confusion like a surgeon's blade. Her courage was forged in a deep, unshakable faith where others saw just a woman. God saw a vessel. Where men faltered in fear, she stood in divine clarity. Deborah was not merely a judge. She was a divine interruption. In a time when complacency choked the spirit of the people, she embodied what it meant to believe without compromise. While others trembled at the sound of chariots, she stood still and listened for the voice of God. Would you have followed her? Would you have believed that the salvation of a nation could come from a woman's unwavering obedience? Her rise wasn't only unexpected, it was prophetic, and what unfolded next would shake the foundations of Israel and reveal just how powerful one obedient heart can be when God says, "Go." Are you waiting for the right person, the qualified leader, the strongest voice, while God is calling Fei to step into the impossible? What excuses are you making about your own qualifications? Are you ready to let God redefine leader through Fei life? Right where you are, with no more than his voice in your heart. The terrified general and the woman's word, will you stand even if you tremble? Imagine being called to fight the biggest battle of your life. The entire nation's freedom rests on Fei's shoulders. The enemy is invincible, and then you flinch. This isn't a story about flawless heroes. It is a story about faithful obedience, even when your knees are knocking. As Deborah sat beneath her palm, the quiet of nature surrounding her, the silence was broken. Not by fear, but by divine revelation. The voice of God spoke with clarity, direction, and undeniable purpose. A plan began to unfold, a sacred strategy to end 2 decades of humiliation. It was not a vision to be kept secret. It was a call to arms, a divine command ready to be acted upon. "Call for Barak son of Abinoam," the Lord instructed. Barak was a warrior from Kadesh in Naphtali, a man with potential, but one who had not yet stepped into his purpose. Have you ever felt that stirring inside, that you were meant for more, but something kept you from rising? Barak was living in that tension, and Deborah was about to ignite what had long been dormant. Barak came, summoned by the prophetess. Was he doubtful? Was he desperate? Either way, he listened as Deborah, speaking not her own words, but God's command, declared, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go, take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them up to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and troops to the Kishon River, and give him into your hands." Judges 4-6-7, the plan was as bold as it was divine. To confront Sisera, whose terrifying iron chariots had crushed every prior resistance, required more than bravery. It demanded trust in the impossible. This wasn't just a battle strategy, it was a heavenly setup, but fear still lingered. Barak's response revealed what many feel when facing the unknown, when staring down the barrel of a divine calling. "If Fei go with me, Fei will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." His voice, perhaps steady on the outside, trembled with the weight of uncertainty. It wasn't that he didn't believe God could deliver, he just didn't believe Fei could do it alone. Do you ever feel that way, called by God, but afraid to move forward unless someone stronger, more qualified, stands beside you? Deborah didn't scold him. She understood the weight of what he was facing, but her answer was both powerful and prophetic. "Certainly, I will go with you, but because of the course you are taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Judges 4-9. This was no ordinary response. It was a spiritual mirror, revealing Barak's hesitation while declaring what was to come. The victory, while certain, would not bear his name. Instead, it would unfold through a most unexpected vessel, a woman. What impossible step is God calling Fei to take? Are you letting fear hold you back from a divine appointment? What if are you clinging to when God is calling you to go? The day the heavens opened, when God fights your battles, you think battles are won with human strategy and military might. What if God decides to rewrite the very rules of war, turning nature itself into his deadliest weapon? The atmosphere begins to shift. Deborah and Barak rise into motion, moving not just themselves, but an entire nation out of dormancy and into destiny. The call rings out across the hills and valleys of Naphtali and Zebulun, from village corners, mountain passes, and hidden strongholds. Men begin to gather. These are not professional soldiers. They are farmers, shepherds, ordinary men who had been crushed for 20 years under the shadow of oppression. But something had changed. Deborah's voice, full of conviction and clarity, had pierced through their fear. Her unwavering trust in God became the spark that reignited the embers of national courage. She didn't rally them with strategy. She rallied them with faith. Standing before them, she reminded them of their legacy. Has not the God of Abraham delivered us from Egypt? Did he not bring down the walls of Jericho? Has he not already proved his arm is mighty to save? Her words were not just history lessons, they were lifelines. With every sentence, the past became a prophecy, and slowly the people began to believe again. As Barak stood beside her, once hesitant, now stirred by Deborah's strength, he gathered 10,000 men, a number that had once seemed impossible. Can you picture them lined along the rising path toward Mount Tabor? Each footstep up the mountain was more than a march. It was an act of trust. They walked with swords that may have been rusty, with armor that didn't gleam like their enemies, but their hearts were no longer bound by fear. Would you have joined them? Would you have followed a woman with nothing but her faith and a God who had been silent for 2 decades? What makes this moment so compelling is not just the military preparation, but the human condition it reveals. Here, we witness the delicate tension between faith and fear. Barak, once reluctant to lead, now steps forward, still uncertain, yet willing. Deborah, with no army of her own, becomes the spiritual general. It is a divine paradox. God was about to unleash deliverance, not through flawless faith, but through faithful obedience. Does that comfort you, to know that God does not require your perfection, only your yes? And now the stage was set. The mountain trembled with the presence of a nation choosing faith over fear. The valley below held the most powerful force the Israelites had ever faced. A sea of soldiers and iron chariots glinting under the sun like blades of terror. For decades, these monstrous machines had chased down the Israelites, swift and merciless. Barak's army, clothed in hope more than armor, appeared pitiful by comparison. Can you feel the weight of that moment? Would your knees have trembled as you looked down from the mountaintop? But before fear could reclaim their hearts, Deborah stepped forward. Her eyes were locked not on the enemy but on the promise. With a voice firm as thunder and calm as still waters, she turned to Barak and declared, "Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" Judges 4:14. These weren't motivational words. They were spiritual instructions, divinely timed and surgically spoken. Heaven had already moved. Now it was Israel's turn. Barak raised his sword. The 10,000 surged forward, down the slopes of Mount Tabor. They charged, unexpected, unrelenting. The very sight stunned Sisera's ranks. The general had expected surrender, not confrontation. His chariots had always inspired terror, but now terror was shifting. Then the skies began to darken without warning. Thick clouds gathered. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and suddenly the heavens cracked open with torrential rain. The ground, once firm and dry, turned into a mire of mud and confusion. The mighty iron chariots, once gliding with deadly grace, now sank helplessly into the earth. Wheels spun and locked. Horses panicked. Soldiers slipped, their formation breaking like shattered glass. This wasn't mere weather. It was Pharaoh from the sky. Pharaoh, the god of Israel, who once parted the Red Sea, now summoned a storm to fight for his people. Psalm 18:14 comes alive here. He shot his arrows and scattered the enemy. With great bolts of lightning he routed them. Nature became God's arsenal, and every raindrop was a declaration that he had not forgotten his covenant. Fueled by divine intervention, the Israelites charged with renewed fury. Barak's army became a whirlwind of righteous vengeance. They didn't fight with the confidence of seasoned warriors, but with the desperation and faith of a people who had seen heaven open on their behalf. Every strike was guided, every blow an echo of the prophecy. The once feared Canaanite force began to crumble, their formation torn apart by both storm and sword. Sisera, witnessing the collapse, knew the tide had turned. Drenched, humiliated, and stripped of control, he abandoned his chariot, the very symbol of his invincibility, and fled on foot. Can you see him now? A man who once commanded thousands, reduced to a desperate fugitive running through the mud. Was this not the fulfillment of Deborah's bold prophecy, that the honor would not be Barak's, but would come through the hands of a woman? Yet, even now, the most unexpected twist had yet to unfold. Where are you struggling in your own strength? What iron chariots in your life seem unbeatable? Are you willing to surrender the fight to a God who can command the heavens to fight for you, even when it looks impossible? The unlikeliest assassin, the tent peg that changed history. If you want to understand the radical, earth-shattering truth about God's justice, pay close attention. It doesn't come from where you expect. It doesn't look like you imagine, and it might just come from the unlikeliest hands. The battle had raged for hours, but by the time the dust began to settle, there was no question who held the field. What had begun as an improbable uprising, 10,000 farmers and villagers charging into the teeth of 900 iron chariots, had turned into a complete and miraculous triumph. The Israelites, once beaten and bruised under the harsh rule of Jabin, now stood tall upon the battlefield, their voices ringing out in victory. Shouts of praise and tears of astonishment mixed with the rain as they looked across the muddy plains, strewn with the wreckage of a once unstoppable enemy. Not a single man from Sisera's army remained standing. The force that had dominated Israel for 2 decades was utterly wiped out. Its pride sunk into the very mud that had betrayed its chariots. Barak, standing breathless among his men, could hardly believe what his eyes beheld. He had once doubted if such a moment was even possible, but now, as he looked across the rain-soaked field, he understood what Deborah had always known. This was no ordinary victory. This wasn't won by human courage or clever planning. It was won by divine intervention. The God of Israel had moved, and nature itself had joined the battle. Have you ever seen something so unlikely, so impossible, that it could feignedly be explained by the hand of God? Would you have recognized the miracle if you were there? Barak did. His earlier fear and hesitation were now replaced with awe and reverence. His obedience, however shaky at first, had been met with overwhelming grace. And then there was Deborah, watching silently from above, her garments soaked with rain, her face calm and resolute. The fulfillment of every word God had spoken to her now lay below. She had believed when others trembled. She had declared victory when no sword had yet been raised. She hadn't led with weapons, she had led with faith. And as she surveyed the battlefield, she knew this was more than a military success. It was a statement from heaven that God's promises still stood, that obedience still moved mountains, and that faith still split history in two. Yet the final chapter had not yet been written. Somewhere beyond the chaos, the defeated Sisera was still alive. Having fled the battlefield on foot, the once mighty general, adorned in armor and reputation, now looked like nothing more than a soaked, desperate fugitive. The symbol of Canaanite supremacy had been reduced to a stumbling man with no army, no honor, and no direction. His iron chariot, his proud stallions, all left behind in the mud. Isn't it sobering how quickly power can vanish? How one man's strength, when separated from God's will, can dissolve into nothing? Weary, disoriented, and desperate to survive, Sisera found his way to a familiar encampment, the settlement of Heber the Kenite. The Kenites had a peace treaty with Jabin, which meant Sisera likely assumed he was now on friendly ground. But assumptions can be dangerous, especially when God has already ordained the outcome. There, standing at the entrance of her tent, was Jael, Heber's wife, a woman of no title, no armor, and no visible threat. And yet, as Sisera approached, staggering with exhaustion, it was Pheshife, who held the final key to this divine drama. What would you have seen in her eyes? Compassion, caution? Could you have guessed that this woman, alone in a tent, was about to fulfill prophecy. Jael greeted him with gentleness, her voice like honey covering steel. "Come, my lord, come right in, don't be afraid." Her words were smooth, inviting, calculated to avoid suspicion. Sisera entered her tent, seeking refuge from the storm, from his shame, from the wrath he knew was following close behind. She offered him a blanket, comfort for a general whose pride was now in tatters. "I am thirsty," he whispered. "Please water." But Jael, in a gesture of deceptive kindness, gave him something more soothing: milk, warm, calming, numbing. As he drank, his eyelids grew heavy. The chaos of battle faded, his breath slowed. His voice, still tinged with command, murmured one final instruction: "Stand guard at the door. If anyone asks, if anyone comes, say, 'No one is here.'" He believed her to be an ally. He assumed she would protect him. Isn't it haunting how easily power trusts where it shouldn't, and how often God uses the overlooked to deliver justice? But Jael was no ordinary woman. She was the hidden instrument of heaven's judgment. Quietly, without haste, she waited for Sisera to fall into deep sleep. The tent grew still, the storm outside now distant, and then, with steady hands and unwavering purpose, she prepared to do what no soldier on the battlefield could: bring an end to the terror of Sisera. What happened next would shake the nation, fulfill Deborah's prophecy, and crown a woman, not a warrior, with the final blow in Israel's miraculous deliverance. As the final echoes of battle faded into the horizon and the blood-soaked plains quieted, Sisera, once the embodiment of Canaanite power, sank into sleep, unaware that he had walked straight into the hands of divine justice. His breathing slowed, lulled by the milk that warmed his exhausted body. The tent around him was still, deceptively peaceful. The woman who had welcomed him, Jael, moved silently through the space, every step deliberate, every motion pregnant with purpose. She had waited for this moment, not with sword or army, but with the discernment and precision of someone called for a task far greater than herself. In a time when men fought with chariots and spears, Jael reached for something much simpler: a tent peg and a hammer. These were tools of survival, of shelter, of the ordinary rhythms of nomadic life. But today they would become weapons of prophecy. Can you imagine holding such tools, knowing the next move you make will shift the destiny of a nation? Would your hands have trembled, or would your spirit have burned with divine resolve? Jael approached Sisera as the tense silence grew deeper. The general lay still, unaware, trusting, and in one swift, singular act of holy courage, she raised the hammer and drove the tent peg straight through his temple. The blow pierced not just flesh, but the very symbol of tyranny that had gripped Israel for 20 years. The mighty general who had once ridden in iron glory, commanding fear with every step, was now pinned lifeless to the earth by the hand of a woman with no title, no army, and no fear. There was no fanfare, no battle cry, just silence and justice. Not long after, Barak arrived, still breathless from his pursuit. His heart no doubt raced with urgency. Where had Sisera gone? Could he still escape? But before he could ask, Jael stepped calmly out of the tent to meet him. Her expression was composed, her voice steady. "Come, and I will show you the man you are looking for." Can you feel the weight of those words? What did Barak expect to see? He entered the tent and found the answer. There, laid before him, was Sisera's corpse, his head still pinned to the ground by the very tent peg Jael had wielded. It was not the battlefield that had claimed him. It was not Barak's sword or Israel's army. It was the obedience of an unlikely woman whose hands had become the very agents of prophecy fulfilled. Deborah's words had come to pass with stunning precision. "The honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." Judges 4-9. And now, standing within that small tent, Barak witnessed what happens when God chooses the unexpected to complete his unstoppable will. Jael was not an Israelite. She was not part of Deborah's tribe, nor a soldier under Barak's command. But none of that mattered. God had chosen her. Isn't that the rhythm of Scripture, that God uses shepherds to defeat giants, exiles to save nations, and barren women to birth prophets? What does that say about who he can use today? Could he be calling Fiufi to something beyond your qualifications? Jael's name would be etched into the eternal story of Israel, not for her lineage or alliances, but for her decisive faith. Her actions sent a message that rippled across generations. When God calls, your background, gender, or status does not disqualify you. He doesn't look at appearance or position. He looks at willingness. And with Sisera's death, the spiritual stronghold over Israel was broken. From this moment forward, the tide of power in the region began to shift. Jabin's grip weakened. The people of Israel, once voiceless in the mud of slavery, now stood again in the echo of victory. And it had all begun because one woman listened to God, another dared to trust him completely, and a third obeyed at the most crucial hour. 3 women, Deborah, the voice of heaven, Jael, the hand of justice, and Israel, the nation finally awakening. Who are you overlooking? What unqualified person, or even what unqualified fee, might God be calling to deliver the most profound breakthrough? Are you ready for God's justice to be uncomfortable, yet perfect? The song of freedom, what will be your legacy? The battle is over. The chains are broken. The impossible has become reality. So, what happens after victory? Do you simply move on, or do you remember who fought for you? Do you sing, and still, one more scene awaited? The song of Deborah, a song of victory, prophecy, and praise that would immortalize this moment as one of the greatest acts of deliverance in Israel's history. The death of Sisera was more than the fall of a man. It was the crumbling of a kingdom built on fear. His demise signaled a seismic shift in Israel's fate, shaking loose the final chains of Jabin's tyranny. The people of Israel, once bowed under the weight of chariots and the silence of God, now stood tall, awakened, emboldened, and no longer afraid. The victory at Mount Tabor had not been just a military campaign. It had been a spiritual resurrection. God had moved, and his people had followed. Jael's tent, once a quiet place of hospitality, had become the unlikely altar of divine justice. Deborah, with her unyielding faith, had become the voice of God in a time of silence. These 2 women, unknown to one another, yet aligned by divine purpose, stood as living proof that the Most High often works through the most unexpected hands. Would you have imagined that deliverance would come not from a king or a warrior, but from a prophetess and a tent dweller? What does that say about the vessels God might be preparing even now, perhaps even you? The battle was over. The oppressors overthrown, the people free. But this moment of triumph could not pass quietly into memory. Deborah, Israel's prophetess and judge, stood before the tribes as the sun pierced through the fading storm clouds. She raised her voice, not in command, but in worship. What followed was not a speech, but a song so rich, so prophetic, that it would echo across the ages. Listen, O kings, give ear, O princes, I, even I, will sing to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord, the God of Israel. Judges 5-3. Her voice rose like incense, weaving poetry and prophecy into a tapestry of divine remembrance. This was no ordinary praise. It was the record of a miracle, sung by the one who had carried its promise in her heart. Her words painted the darkness they had come from, a time when roads were abandoned, when life in the villages had vanished, when fear ruled and courage was scarce. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted. Travelers took winding paths. Village life ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel. Judges 5-6-7. She did not call herself a queen or a warrior, but a mother, one who rises not for power, but to protect, to awaken, to give life where death had reigned. The song continued, honoring those who had risen when called. She praised the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, who risked their lives for freedom, and honored Barak, who had marched down Mount Tabor into the jaws of death because he believed. But Deborah did not flinch from the truth. She rebuked the tribes that stayed behind, those who remained in their ships and at their campfires, unwilling to fight. Her words were fire and light, celebration and warning wrapped in one. Are you one who rises when God calls, or do you remain hidden when the battle begins? And then, in a crescendo of divine drama, she described the battle, not as seen by men, but as seen from heaven. The earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water, the mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai. Judges 5-4-5, nature itself had joined the fight, the stars aligned with the will of God, the Kishon River became a weapon of the Almighty. From the heavens the stars fought, from their courses they fought against Sisera, the river Kishon swept them away. Judges 5-20-21. But Deborah's song was not content to only glorify the cosmic. It turned back to the human, specifically to Jael. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, most blessed of tent-dwelling women. Judges 5:24. With haunting beauty, Deborah did not avoid the brutal detail of Jael's act. She celebrated it as holy obedience. She struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. Judges 5:26. The imagery was vivid, almost too graphic for comfort. But that was the point. God's justice is not always clean or polite. It is righteous, and sometimes it is fierce. Can you see how God used Jael's hands, not as an accident of war, but as instruments of prophecy fulfilled? Deborah's final verses turned toward the future. Not only the peace that had come, but the path forward. She offered a blessing and a warning. So may all your enemies perish, O Lord, but may those who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. Judges 5:31. It was a call to remain faithful, to rise with passion and purity, to let no darkness find shelter among God's people again. And with that, the land had peace for 40 years. Deborah's song became more than a memory. It became a standard, a banner, a reminder that the God of Israel is not bound by tradition, nor limited by expectation. He can raise up a mother to lead nations, a tent dweller to slay a general, and a hesitant soldier to command victory. So ask yourself, if he did it then, could he be doing it now? Could he be writing a new song? One where Fi are the voice, the vessel, the rising light in the dawn of deliverance. What song are you singing in your life? Are you celebrating God's faithfulness? Are you actively remembering His power? What will be the legacy of your obedience? Will your life be a testament to His unyielding strength?